This is the story of one family's experience eating all locally grown food in Montana. The Bledsoes, a family of 3 from Missoula, which is a town of about 60,000 in southwestern Montana, decided they could give up the excesses of today's food system for a simpler way of life. And a much more time-consuming one. Why? Well, in short, because I asked them to. A few months ago, I was reading about local food and different people's opinions on why we should eat locally. Researchers at Iowa State University say, on average, a meal in America travels 1,500 miles from farm to plate. That's halfway across the United States. Many advocates say eating locally reduces this mileage and is easier on the environment and benefits local economies and communities. I thought, yeah, that all sounds good, but how easy is it to actually do? So I looked for a family who was willing to give it a shot, and the Bledsoes agreed, just as kind of a test to see if a normal family could do it. And they got through it, together, as a family.
Wyatt, would you like to roll out some dough?
You want to help, Mom?
You want to get your stool? Come over here.
Here. Here's the stool.
Ben and Judith Bledsoe are in their mid-30s and have a 2-year-old son, Wyatt. Wyatt loves playing with trains. And is also really into watching shows about the mischievous monkey, Curious George. He even has some stuffed animal monkeys to carry around on his own little adventures. But right now his parents are preparing for their own adventure in local food.
A friend gave me the idea of making pasta. And so,
But you did have one friend that kind of offhandedly referred to it as a dumb idea.
Yeah, but I think she didn't really know what she was talking about.
There isn't an official definition for local food. No specific mileage range. Some people shoot for a 100-mile range, others 400 miles. But for this experiment, all the food the Bledsoes eat for 2 weeks in September and 2 weeks in January has to come from Montana, meaning it has to have been grown and processed in Montana. And if there's an ingredient in a meal that isn't from Montana, they can't eat it. Ben says they're into this kind of thing. They have chickens in their backyard and a greenhouse with herbs and some vegetables growing in it. They also order bees every summer and harvest the honey. Judith agrees eating locally won't be a totally new concept for them. When Ben and Judith were in the Peace Corps and lived on the small island of Tonga, east of Australia, most of the food they ate came from the island. But currently, Judith says her family isn't concerned with knowing where their food comes from.
We're just not. We buy a package of something, or just buy something from the grocery store.
Normally, Judith does most of her shopping at Costco, and before the local food challenge, most of the food in her fridge was from there.
Costco grapes, Costco pickles, Costco applesauce, Costco pesto, Costco garlic in bulk, black olives from the Good Food store.
She pulls some olives out of the fridge to give Wyatt for a snack and wonders what it will be like to withhold certain foods from her child.
When do you get olives in Montana? It's not going to happen. If you were, for the next couple of weeks, we'll be olive free. I don't know how you'll do with that, Wyatt. He's a big olive fan.
And Judith is a big chocolate fan. The lack of it worries her a little. Despite her affinity for sweets, Judith is a petite and strong woman who looks like she works out often. She has shoulder-length brown hair, a broad face with fair skin, dimples in her cheeks, and sparkly brown eyes. She spends most of her time raising Wyatt, but also works as a writing coach at the University of Montana 2 days a week. Her husband, Ben, is the CEO of a home health care company. He travels frequently and is very busy, so Judith does most of the cooking for her family.
I feel like I used to do some when we were first married, but I kind of just faded out of a lot of the cooking. I guess it's like the traditional male fantasy of you come home from work and there's a hot meal on the table. It's like...
Ben is about 6 feet tall with a thin but strong frame. His hair is short and dark with specks of gray coming in around the forehead and sideburns. He has a boxy chin, thin lips, and kind brown eyes, framed by crow's feet. Ben says neither he nor Judith are big coffee drinkers, so that won't be much of a problem. But he does like to drink beer. They've been doing research, looking up what they'll have and what they'll have to go without.
There's a lot of meat options.
I don't think we're going to be able to get some of the larger things, but like we talked about before, it's some of the smaller stuff that we're confused about, like
Salt.
the salt, the pepper,
Oil.
oil, yeah, sugar.
Ben and Judith say if there's a salt lick anywhere in Montana, they will find it.
There could be a salt lick around here somewhere. I don't know.
The weekend before the Bledsoes started their local food challenge, they went to a wedding in Portland, Oregon. They got back Sunday evening and hustled to the Good Food Store, an independent organic and natural food store in Missoula, to pick up whatever local items they could find. Otherwise, they hadn't really prepared. If the Good Food Store knows the origin of the product, they label it. And things from Montana have a sticker with the shape of the state on them. This helped the Bledsoes as they rushed through the store, tossing random but local items into their cart. It was late September, so there were still plenty of things like leafy green vegetables and tomatoes. However, it was during this first shopping experience that Judith realized buying local isn't as cut and dried as it seems. Cheese, for example, requires cultures or bacteria that help ferment the cheese. Judith, an avid cheesemaker herself, stared at the locally marked cheeses, wondering if the cultures were local too. She asked the store employee, who told her they probably weren't, but Judith decided she wanted cheese and granted herself this exception. The next day, the first day, Judith ran into a similar problem.
I realized as I shoved a handful of fries from Pro 6 Cafe in my mouth that we had accidentally eaten salt with the fries.
The potatoes from the cafe were grown in Montana, but the closest salt mines are in Utah. She struggled again when Wyatt saw some goodies in the fridge he couldn't have.
He opened this and started demanding what he saw. I don't want to say it too loudly. Ice cream sandwiches.
But Judith was resourceful and reconciled the situation.
It was fine. I ended up giving him a piece of cheese. And that was okay. A dairy substitute.
That night, they made tacos for dinner, and Judith and Wyatt had to hand-make tortillas. Right away, Judith noticed that eating locally took more time.
It does take more preparation. Normally I wouldn't make my own tortillas. But, it was fun. Wyatt enjoyed it.
She says this project will probably cause her to learn many new cooking skills.
When you have food limitations like we were talking about now, it forces you to learn how to cook and to really be able to figure out ways to get yourself fed.
The second night, Judith roasted a whole chicken. The chickens are raised in Choteau, Montana, by a religious colony called the Hutterites, and the Good Food Store carries their products. Judith mixed herbs from her garden with butter, let it soften, and then spread it on the chicken.
It's not quite as soft as I would like, but it'll still be delicious.
She doesn't normally cook whole chickens. Usually she buys frozen chicken breasts in bulk from Costco.
They're individually frozen and not huge. And you can just take out what you need.
But with a large whole chicken, Judith's plan was to have lots of leftovers. However, this chicken didn't turn out so well. It ended up being bloody because she accidentally left the giblets and the neck inside the chest cavity. She tried putting it back in the oven the next day, but said it still tasted too fleshy, so she threw it away. Cooking whole chickens is one skill Judith will work on. The Bledsoes had to step out of their comfort zone in many ways during this project, leaving convenience behind and doing things in a more time-consuming way. Thursday night, they went to a small farmer's market in a church parking lot away from the city center. It was a cold and windy fall day, and Judith hoped to find herbs or anything flavorful to replace salt. She explained her dilemma to a farmer at one of the booths, seeking insight.
We're doing a local food experiment for 2 weeks where we're just eating local foods, and it's going really well except for the salt. There's no salt in Montana.
No, there's not.
But we thought peppers would at least give some flavor, even though the salt is not present.
While Judith bought peppers, Ben bought some garlic powder that the farmers made.
Holy cow. Wow, yeah, that's really pungent.
Judith also bought 5 pounds of tomatoes from the farmers because she's got plans to make salsa and a large batch of marinara.
I spent a long time yesterday making tomato sauce, making marinara sauce. It was so good, but it took all day.
She wants to make a huge batch this time, so she doesn't have to keep making it.
The tomatoes were so good, but it used a lot more than I thought because they simmer down so much.
While Judith was buying tomatoes, Ben had been scouring the rest of the tables.
Hey guys.
I got squash and potatoes and pears because Wyatt decided to eat a pear. So
Judith says these are all things they'd normally buy, but they would just buy them at a grocery store closer to home. This farmer's market in particular is out of the way for them, but they wanted to see what else was available besides the food at the good food store. So Judith is trying to stock up.
I'm trying to decide if we should buy some meat while we're here. We have a roast going right now at our house and it smells unreal.
In the end, Judith thought sirloin steak sounded like a good idea.
All right,
Cool. Have a good day, guys.
and just so you know, the beef has not been fed to any grain. It's all grass
nice.
or fruit or garden stuff.
Perfect. It's cold out there, buddy.
On the way home, the Bledsoes talked about their experience.
It's actually easier to shop at this farmer's market than the big one.
Oh, yeah.
They ended up buying pears, potatoes, plums, 5 pounds of tomatoes, peppers, spicy peppers, garlic salt, broccoli, and beef. And Ben was really tempted by one woman's homemade sweets.
The fudge was tempting. She had a bunch of fudge samples. Did you see that?
No.
I said, oh man. I said, how do you make the fudge? She said, with marshmallows and chocolate chips and a bunch of other very good stuff. I was like, yeah,
That sounds good.
too bad.
The Bledsoes said they learned things about the food they bought, things they normally don't know, like who grew it and how and where.
The guy told us about the beef. You know, the beef is all grass-fed. There's no grain.
Yeah, that's information you can almost never get.
Judith says this kind of information is becoming more important to her, but also says her past buying history would reveal she never gave it a thought.
It's funny though, in my mind I was going it back and forth about going to this place in the first place, going to the farmer's market over here, because I kept thinking, oh, it's all the way across town, that's a lot of gas to use to get there. And I really thought about it, that, well, where does my food usually travel from? South America, perhaps? Peru? This is not a big deal to drive across town.
She says meeting the people who grew her food makes her appreciate it more.
I think I would feel more guilty letting this broccoli go bad than I would have felt when my Costco broccoli goes bad.
That's very true. I mean, if we would have ever bought kale before, I seriously doubt we would have ever really cooked it and tried to eat it. I bet it would have sat there in their shelf. But with this, we have been eating every single thing.
Ben says putting effort into his food, too, changes the way he thinks about it.
Doing the research and going and finding it and doing the cooking, which is, Judith spent a long time cooking yesterday. I
told her about the marinara sauce.
So
it was so good.
I
But
think
it
when
took
you
a long time.
Yeah, you
to
put that
make.
much effort into it, you're gonna eat it.
Though
You're gonna eat
most of
all.
it, to be fair, is passive time. Just simmering,
still-
keeping an eye on it.
It's still effort.
The following weekend, the Bledsoes dedicated an entire day to cooking food. They said the first week felt crazy because they weren't prepared.
It was very intentional. Every day I had to think about it, think it through, make a plan, think ahead, really put effort into it.
So today their plan is to cook as much as possible so they have less work to do during the week. On most weekends, the Bledsoes are usually traveling, hanging out with friends, or doing yard work. But today, they are going to make a mess in the kitchen. They have plans to fry squash, make salsa, marinara, broccoli sauce, and breakfast muffins.
Wyatt, please don't climb on the table. Thank you.
Ben is making his mother's recipe for breaded squash. After slicing the squash, he dips it in egg, then a flour and herb mixture, and fries it in butter. Ben says eating locally has been good so far. He feels good about the food he is eating, and everything has been really tasty. But he's had to let go of that instant gratification mindset.
A lot of times I think the lifestyle is, let's get something to eat now. And it's, from the moment you're like, I'm hungry, give me food. And now it's a little more, it takes thought.
Judith was really excited because Ben helped her do some mealtime strategizing.
Last night we pulled everything out, and Ben, for the first time, collaborated with me on a meal plan. It was so fun.
The first time in a long time, how about that?
I hold it is the first time we have truly collaborated on a meal plan.
After a few hours of cooking, the Bledsoes took a break to eat lunch. They had local beef with melted cheese on top of it and some of the squash. Ben said the yellow squash tasted the best.
Good.
The next week, the Bledsoes said preparing all that food helped things go more smoothly. However, they both struggled in social situations. There were a few times at work when Ben's coworkers invited him out to lunch, and he declined and just ate food in his office. Or he told them he would go, but could just drink water. Judith cheated one day when she went out to lunch with her friend. Her friend wanted to go out to eat after they ran in a race and picked a restaurant downtown.
And the server just looked at me when I said, "What do you have that's local?" She said, "We don't do that here." It was hard because I realized that's the reality of so many restaurants, and I've never asked the question before. But my guess is 90% of restaurants, they would look at me in a very similar way.
Both Ben and Judith say if they were to try something like this long term, they would create a social life clause, meaning when they went out with friends, all restrictions were off.
So I felt a lot of pressure, kind of that social pressure of we've just run a 5K, I'm starving. But it was kind of like an internal struggle because I didn't want to cheat.
Judith said this was her least favorite part of the project, always asking people where food was from. She said it made her feel like a snob.
Or
And it
don't
feels
do
like
that.
such a privileged conversation
It is.
to have. Like, I'm choosing to just have local foods. I could buy anything that I want, but...
Yeah, so you can feel like you're putting other people out, and they're judging you because they feel like you're judging them. Like, oh my God, are you really that person? And then
I'm really self-conscious about that.
Yeah.
Ben and Judith thought about it for a minute and concluded that knowing where your food comes from shouldn't be a pretentious thing.
I guess if enough people cared about that, then it would be the norm, and you could just trust that something was pretty local.
Funny that it's pretentious. Don't
Yeah,
you
it just
think?
seemed- it just
Back in the
seemed-
day, that would have been just so normal.
You would think it would be the opposite, where it's the affluent thing is being able to eat chocolate because it's from so far away, you can drink coffee and all those things. But now it's like it's expanded to everything. Oh, well, we're going to eat some chicken that was from Georgia, it's the side of the country, and I don't know. It's just odd to think that is the cheaper way to do it.
Ben and Judith are on to something here. A lot of the food we eat travels further in a week than some of us have in our entire lives. Food regularly travels between states, nations, and continents. But just a few decades ago, things were very different. The USDA says until about 1950, 70% of the food Montanans ate was grown in Montana. But by 2006, only 10% of the food Montanans ate came from within the state. Due to new agricultural production systems, bigger tractors, and chemicals that make plants grow faster and easier, farmers can produce more food than they ever could before. Also, with the development of global transportation, Montana became a major exporter of food, and also a major importer. People now have access to fruits and vegetables from all over the world because of refrigerated trucks and airplanes. The manager of a local educational farm and lecturer at the University of Montana, Josh Slotnick, is opposed to the transfer of perishable food items over long distances. He is one of the chief local food advocates in Missoula.
I don't know that you could find a stronger local food advocate than myself.
But Slotnick says eating 100% locally, like the Bledsoes are doing, is a little crazy. He tries to follow what he calls the Marco Polo rule.
So Marco Polo, famous explorer, ran about the globe on a sailboat and carried turmeric from one side of the globe and brought back rock salt from the other. If Marco Polo could have brought it around the world, I think it's okay for me to participate in the same economy.
But Slotnick only applies this rule to things like spices, chocolate, and grains, things that won't spoil and can be shipped slowly.
Now that's an entirely different animal than saying I'm going to get Argentinian bananas for breakfast because it's really important to me to eat bananas. I think that's kind of stupid and a big giant carbon footprint.
Slotnick says eating locally, for the most part, is better for the environment. He also says food tastes better when it's fresh, and tasty food brings people together.
There's a great benefit in this, and it is that the act of cooking And eating together really good food is spectacularly rewarding. That's it. You're going to eat better food, and the quality of your life goes up almost immeasurably through the act of cooking whole food and sitting down with people you care about and eating a well-prepared meal.
Slotnick says when you cook a real meal, you care about the ingredients. And the more you care about the food you're preparing, the more you'll want people to sit down and eat it with you.
Think about what the table does, right? This table pulls together all the food and their various histories, and it also brings the people together that live in that household and their histories.
Slotnick says when people eat together, they get to know each other and therefore start to care about each other. He also makes an economic argument for local food. He says spending money on local food, or at local stores in general, keeps money in town.
Economists have said that money spent can be respent up to 7 times in one locality before it spins out. Right here in Missoula, each time it's spent, it covers somebody's efforts, or it helps to cover someone's efforts who's remaining here, creating a livelihood, hopefully a righteous livelihood that pay other people. It contributes to our whole betterment. And we know from living here when the town's doing well, I've been here a long time, and when it's not doing well. And when it's doing well, you don't see boarded up storefronts or for rent signs all over downtown. And you go downtown and the streets are full of people, or the bike paths are full. There's just a vibrancy and a quality of life that's deeply enhanced. I don't feel like I should have to make the argument why a boost in economics increases quality of life, but it does.
Ultimately, local food is about sustainability for Slotnick, and sustainability in his mind is caring for people and caring for the ground under our feet.
So I feel like cooking is a medium, is a way to get towards sustainability on a social sense, also sustainability on an ecological sense.
He says food produced locally doesn't travel as far, so it uses less fuel, producing less carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas. He also says when food is grown locally, there is a lot of pressure on the farmer to bypass toxic chemicals. Slotnick says if his neighbors saw him spraying his fields, they would go nuts.
There's no way, I think about my neighborhood, if I got on my tractor in a hazmat suit and started spraying along my neighbor's borders, they would come unglued. They don't want anything that needs a hazmat suit in their backyard.
In the end, Slotnick reiterated that eating locally comes with common sense.
I think that, especially if we're talking about this in light of the hardworking, noble family you're talking about, I feel like pretty much all the goals that I described, economic, environmental, and sort of social, cultural, all those goals can be worked towards effectively through participating in the local food system without being as dogmatic and intentional as your family is being. That's silliness. We don't need to fuss about where the salt came from.
Slotnick says eating local food could reduce greenhouse gas emissions and potentially help thwart climate change. However, some researchers say that is not entirely true. They say it all depends. About 16% of the total energy used in the United States goes to food production and transport, and this production and transport is mostly powered by fossil fuels, giving the food system a fairly heavy carbon footprint. However, this footprint can increase or decrease depending on how the food is grown, processed, packaged, and shipped. Just counting the miles something traveled is not necessarily an accurate way to evaluate its environmental impact. Plus, the USDA says transportation only accounts for about 10% of the CO2 emissions related to the food system. Most of the greenhouse gases come from the use of pesticides and fertilizers. But the type of travel does have an impact. From most efficient to least efficient type of transport, it goes sea transport, railroads, truck transport, air freight, then consumers' cars. A researcher at the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture in Iowa says small, locally based food systems are usually most reliant on the least efficient types of vehicles. He estimated that local food systems in Iowa use more fuel than regional food systems that rely on larger semi-trailers and mid-sized trucks, but also said both local and regional food systems use 1/10 the amount of fuel conventional long-distance distribution systems use. However, economist for the Sustainable Business Council in Missoula, Sue Anderson, says these studies are not one-size-fits-all. She says fuel consumption rate and greenhouse gas emissions depend on how far the farmers are driving and how far the people are driving to get to the market.
Now, there are some interesting studies out there that show, there was one done in England that was reported in The Economist that actually showed that farmers markets used more fuel than at the local grocery store. In an area like London, that makes sense. In an area like Missoula, where your farmer's market is as close as your grocery store, then those comparisons don't necessarily hold up.
Anderson says if we redeveloped our local food system, meaning more growers and processors right here in the state, our carbon footprint would be greatly reduced.
So we grow a lot of stuff, ship it out of state, and bring it back.
For example, there are many ranchers in Montana that raise cattle, but there aren't any large-scale butchers or processors in the state to handle that much beef. So ranchers ship their cattle out of state, and then some of the beef is shipped back to us. Anderson says if local farmers grew more food, there would be a greater need for processors in the state, and food wouldn't have to travel so far.
So by redeveloping local production systems, do we then get ourselves in a better place for the future at points in time when transporting things is going to be very expensive, as fuel prices will continue to go up for a variety of reasons.
Over time, Anderson says the price of fossil fuels will go up, and the less reliant we are on them, the cheaper our food will be.
Yeah, it may be cheaper right now, but are we building a system that will last long term, or are we going to have some abrupt changes at some point in time that are going to be very painful?
Oil is a finite resource, and in Anderson's opinion, it would be a good idea to prepare for the day when access to oil is limited.
If we're going to use fossil fuels, we ought to be using them to set ourselves up for that steeper curve. So a good use of fossil fuels in my mind is to build more solar and to build more wind and to build more of the tools that we need to survive through that.
It's the same mentality that intrigued Judith to want to participate in this project. One of her major inspirations was the Transition Handbook by Rob Hopkins. The handbook calls for more resilient communities, or communities that can depend on themselves for things they need to survive.
The transition movement is based on the realization that peak oil, if it hasn't passed already, is imminent. Probably is already passed, though. I'd never heard the term peak oil before, so that was really a new concept to even think about, that this is finite.
The author suggests the next step is a local resilience, including a resurgence in local food, creating food security. Judith says after she read the Transition Handbook, she was really motivated to heed its words.
I totally bought it. It made so much sense. I'm like, oh, common sense. I love when people apply, really use logic and common sense solutions.
However, she didn't really change her lifestyle much at first. Then, this local food challenge came along, and she thought it was the perfect opportunity for her to practice what she learned, even if it meant eating only potatoes, meat, squash, and cabbage during the wintertime.
Montana produce right now?
Montana produce.
Yeah.
It's very limited right now.
I bet.
It's now January in Montana, and the Bledsoes are ready for round two. Round two of eating nothing but local food. On the second day, Judith went to the good food store to pick up a few things.
Most of the stuff we're getting is dairy.
But Judith is hopeful she will find some green produce. The lady working in the section says they have cabbage and a few other things, but that's it.
No.
I'm sorry. The beets are the only thing here.
That's fine.
Although onions, the cipollini's and the shallots and garlic.
Judith says they have plenty of beets at home, which they are struggling to eat because no one in her family likes them. They paid $100 in late fall for 100 pounds of winter crops, like beets, potatoes, carrots, onions, and squash, and still have quite a bit left. Like she said, she's mainly here for dairy products and honey, but puts a large green cabbage in her cart before moving on. As she fills her container with honey, she talks about her plans for the week.
I actually do have quite a bit of cooking to do. Pumpkin cookies. We're straining yogurt into Greek yogurt that we made yesterday. And there's maybe making granola. I don't know exactly how to make granola yet, though, so we'll have to find out.
Next, she stops by the dairy section, and to her surprise, Kalispell Creamery, a local dairy, now makes cream.
Yes! This is brand new. And look at the great price.
Judith says it's little things like this that make her life a whole lot easier.
They haven't stocked cream. I looked for this everywhere in September. And with cream, you can make creme fraiche or sour cream or anything. So I was going to try to make it with their half and half, but this means I don't have to. Score. They just started carrying this. Just in time. It's kismet. It really is. The universe comes together.
She continues to saunter around the store, picking things up and reading labels. seeing if there's anything else that will make her life easier for the next 2 weeks.
They kind of had some local stuff over here. I just wanted to take a look.
Judith picks up a bag of dried beans and peas, prepackaged into something you'd make soup with.
Let's see where these are grown or made. It doesn't say. It's organic.
The package has a Made in Montana label on it, but Judith knows from experience this doesn't necessarily mean all the ingredients are from Montana.
Do you think that means grown in Montana though? That's hard to know. You could look at their website. My guess is that this is marketed here and made and like put together here, but probably not necessarily grown here because they're not saying that. We should look in the bulk stuff too because they might have some local like lentils that we could for sure source.
Judith got some lentils, checked the sausages, and considered getting another chicken, but decided against it because she didn't like the last one. She added a few packages of local cheese to her almost empty cart and headed out to pick up Wyatt from daycare. Back at home, Judith is cutting up the cabbage she just bought. She's going to make her mother's cabbage with cheese recipe and steak. The Bledsoes bought a quarter of a cow from a local rancher in preparation for this winter session. They also had to buy a freezer to keep it in. Judith also tried canning some vegetables, but it didn't work like she wanted.
Our beets went bad.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it went bad waiting for the wine to mold.
Judith tried to make some red wine vinegar to put her beets up in, but somehow the vinegar got all moldy.
Which sucked because it was like a $13 bottle of wine. I don't know the specifics, but Range Rider, it's not cheap.
Yeah.
So I had this bottle of wine every day, stirring, most days when I remembered, but usually every day. And it just molded. I don't know what I did wrong.
Judith says she feels like she's living in Little House on the Prairie sometimes. She just reread the series last year.
They are fascinating for many, many reasons, but one of it is their description of food and cooking. They planned a lot, I remember, and they almost died one winter. They almost starved, so it's unpredictable, the long winter.
Both Ben and Judith agree the wintertime has been much more difficult.
There aren't really that many fresh fruits or vegetables. Wyatt's been eating nothing but huckleberries, where last time he had all kinds of fruit.
And carrots.
Yeah.
I'm worried that we'll eat our favorite things and then have to eat things we don't really like, but we're not going to starve.
The Bledsoes made it through the rest of the winter by hand slicing and frying potato chips, eating a lot of meat, and making bread with local Missoula yeast. They say eating locally saved them about $50 a week, but only because they couldn't go out to eat as often as they normally do. In general, food was more expensive, but they were happy to find that the beef from their cow was relatively inexpensive, only $3.85 a pound. Again, the winter session was harder than the fall session. During the winter, there were a few slips. Ben went out to eat with his employees, and Wyatt got to eat some things that weren't local because his parents decided he's a normal kid, and they shouldn't withhold normal kid things from him, like popcorn and cookies. Judith got to leave a few days early from the project to go on a trip with her friends, and couldn't stop talking about how she wanted to go to the sushi restaurant. And, during the winter session, they let themselves eat salt. Ben and Judith lost 5 pounds each during the fall session and 5 pounds during the winter, despite eating a lot of meat, cheese, butter, and bacon fat. They said they both felt healthier, but don't plan on doing another local food challenge anytime soon. Judith does plan on changing the way she shops and eats, though.
I don't think you can go back. That's the thing. It's like, once you know something in a really personal, first-hand way, it's really hard to pretend you don't know that already.
A week after their winter session ended, I caught up with Ben and Judith just to check in. Judith said she had canceled her Costco membership because she plans on buying fresher food from now on. And Ben was excited to have the beer drawer in the refrigerator stocked again. They both said challenging themselves to eat locally was fun and very educational. It wasn't the most scientific experiment. Nobody took a measurement of the CO2 emitted from the project. But they do feel that some of the environmental, economic, and social claims that local food advocates make might be true. Most of their food came from farms within 100 miles. Judith said during the project her Costco bill changed to a farmer's market bill, and Ben said they threw out a lot less trash. But this is just one family's experience eating locally in Missoula, Montana. This has been Emily Wendler reporting.